Good morning, friends, and thank you for joining me for this week's discussion of the Parsha Vayeishev. I want to let you know that I do stream the morning shacharit prayer Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and then the Parsha discussion on Sundays at noon, same thing, Pacific Standard Time. As I said, we'll be discussing Vayeishev this week, and basically we'll go over what the Torah says, what the sages have said, some of my thoughts, and how you can incorporate these ideas into your life. I wanted to mention that you're welcome to make donations on Patreon. The link is in the description below, as well as on the channel homepage. And any contributions are greatly appreciated. So we'll get started. And first thing I'd like to do is to give to tzedakah. I always like to give right before I study. Okay, and then we will recite the blessings for the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha b'finu u'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niech anachnu v'tzatzeienu v'tzatzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bahar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. Okay, so we'll get started on this week's Torah portion. So as I said, this week's portion is Vayeishev, and basically in this Torah portion we look at basically Yosef and his interactions with Yaakov, how he's favored by Yaakov, given the infamous coat by Yaakov, his interactions with his brothers, telling his brothers of the dreams that he had, the brothers' envy. Yosef is thrown into a pit, sold to Ishmaelites, and then the brothers relate to Yaakov that Yosef was killed. And then we have this little interlude in between the story of Yosef. It basically discusses Yehuda and his sons. He impregnates his daughter-in-law. And then we return back to Yosef's story, where he was sold to one of Pharaoh's ministers in Egypt, becomes the overseer of that household. Then the minister's wife makes accusations against Yosef. Yosef is imprisoned. While there, he interprets the dreams of other prisoners, and those prisoners leave the prison, and that's where we end. First starting out, we're looking at the relationship that's between Yosef and Yaakov. One thing that's interesting to note is in Midrash Rabbah, taking a look at the different similarities that Yaakov and Yosef had, and they had an innumerable amount of similarities to the point where it's almost like we press rewind on the video cassette and we're going all the way back and we're starting again. So some of the similarities that we have, sibling rivalries, we had Yaakov and Esav, we have Yosef and his brothers, exile from their homeland. Both characters have to leave for decades. there are just so many different similarities between the two. So that's really interesting to note. So next, we'll talk a little bit about the opening line for this week's Parsha. And it reads, Jacob dwelt in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. And so there's an interesting distinction to make here. This was the land that Yitzhak sojourned in, and this is the land that Yaakov dwelt in. So you have one person sojourning through the land, one person actually dwelling in the land. And there's a lot of commentary on this. What is the difference between Yitzhak and Yaakov? Why did one dwell in the land while another just sojourned? And a lot of the discussion revolves around the idea that Yaakov dwelt in this land to find peace and to be able to relax and in a way sort of be done with his journey. Yitzhak was journeying, Yaakov wanted to be done with his journey. And it's really interesting, this concept, because there's an idea that there isn't the time to relax in this world, regardless of whether you are outside your home or within your home. Throughout our existence, we have continuous turmoil, continuous ups and downs, as we discussed in a previous Parsha, and our work is never done. And according to the Midrash, this caused Yosef's turmoil for Yaakov. We'll see later that Yosef's brothers tell Yaakov that he was killed, and then Yaakov is in a period of mourning, and so the turmoil continues for Yaakov, regardless of the fact that he's in his home. And so that idea that we're never done is an important one. In Mishnah Avot, we see that the reward is according to the difficulty. So depending on the difficulties that we go through, that will determine the reward that is received. And we see this every day, in everyday life, whether it's, income earned for hours worked, or sometimes with a diet per se, the person who works harder has a greater reward. And it reminds me of something that was told to me by my first rabbi, Rabbi Gershon Weissman, and he said that he doesn't know what exists in the world to come. He doesn't know what that's about. He doesn't understand its existence, but he lives his life in a way that he will be worthy of the world to come. And we don't have the evidence of the existence or what things will be like, but to live your life in a way day by day that whatever it is that you receive, you've earned. So if you do good things, you'll earn good things. And so the idea isn't to focus on the end of the journey. It's not to focus on dwelling in the land of Canaan as Yaakov did, but rather the journey and what steps you take along that journey to get to that place. So that's an interesting opening to this Parsha. And then we continue on, and we discuss Joseph and his brothers, and how they tended flocks. And at the end of the next verse, there's a very interesting line. It says, "And Joseph brought evil tales about them to their father." And I read this a couple times without doing any study or anything, and I questioned it, and I said, evil tales, what exactly does that mean? Were the tales concerning his brothers doing evil things, or were the tales evil in that Yosef was telling Yaakov? Because as we know, we shouldn't say negative things about people, and this idea that they're evil tales, are they true? Are they accurate? Are they not? But regardless of that, where does the evil lie? So if we just take the sentence, Joseph brought evil tales about them to their father, it doesn't specify what's evil. It could be either one of those things. It could be both of those things. It could be what his brothers were doing was evil, or it was evil that he was talking negatively about his brothers. And so I thought about this, and I thought, somebody like Yosef, why, if he was being evil in basically tattletaling on his brothers, why did he do this? Did he not know that this was not a good thing to do? And I thought to myself, well, that's not possible. I mean, it's possible, but not likely. In that he learned from Yitzhak, who learned from Abraham, and so we've got this lineage of teachings. And we see that Yosef was Yaakov's favorite. He was favored. And so it's only right to assume that the teachings were imparted down to Yosef about right from wrong and the path that he should be on. So the question becomes, why did he tell these tales if he knew that it wasn't right to do? And the conclusion that I come to is that it's part of Hashem's will, and others have come to this conclusion as well, other sages. If he knew this was wrong and did it anyways, I infer from that was Hashem's will. He had to have a motivating factor in order to do that, and that would be Hashem's will. In that, as I said before, in the Midrash, the turmoil is to continue for Yaakov, regardless of his idea that he is done and he's going to sit back and relax. And so it reminds me of the Parsha that will be coming up soon about Pharaoh's heart, and the discussion that Hashem has hardened Pharaoh's heart. It wasn't Pharaoh whose heart was hardened. It's that Hashem caused his heart to be hardened. And along the same lines, if this was Hashem's will, it's almost as if saying Hashem sent Yosef to tell his father the evil tales. And so, as I said before, this from the Midrash, this translates to Yaakov's continued turmoil. And it's interesting, one thing that Rashi says, he says, the Holy One, blessed is he, says, is it not enough for the righteous that they have the world to come in all its glory waiting for them, that they wish peace in this world too? And again, it goes back to that idea that the tribulations and the work is never done. It always continues, but through that work, a greater reward is earned. And we spoke about this a little bit with Yaakov's ladder, but the idea is that what if the tribulations ended? Let's say halfway through your life, you were done with the hardships and everything was good. At that point, would you continue to strive and continue to work harder? So this idea of the tribulations and things to overcome gives us the motivation to continue to keep working, continue to stay on the path, and to continue to serve Hashem. It would be very easy for human beings, if they received everything they wanted, to say, okay, good, I have everything I've wanted. I don't need to stay on the path anymore. I don't need to devote my service to Hashem because I have everything I need. But we don't do that. We continue with the tribulations and the trials, and we continue our service despite those trials. Okay, so we'll continue now. And next we will get to the dreams. And so we have a couple dreams here. And it's interesting that there's two of them. There's the first dream that Yosef has, where he and his brothers are gathering the sheaves and binding them in the middle of a field, and Yosef's sheaf stands upright and his brothers bow to him in a way that means that in the future his brothers will bend towards them. It says that in the actual Torah portion that the brothers will prostrate themselves as the sheaves do. And again, this is something that's interesting about the idea that the work is never done. The service continues. And so, when I look at this, I looked at first, it's the idea of gathering all our resources together. It's kind of the idea of a rope. If you have a single strand of thread, it's not all that strong, but if you wrap these threads around each other and you have a nice thick rope, that's something that's very strong. And so it's symbolic of gathering all of your resources and pointing all those resources in a single direction and not to be scattered. We have a lot of things going on in life, and we can move this direction and we can move that direction and pursue this and pursue that. But perhaps the most effective is that if we have all of our sheaves focused in one direction towards the service of Hashem, that way we will be stronger, and it'll allow us to more easily accomplish other facets in our life if we're dedicated to this singular facet. And that's something that we see in, for example, the Vayeishev, where we recite that you should love Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and all of your resources. Dedicate all of that to one purpose, and you will experience success, not just in that purpose, but in other purposes as well. And so we ask, what is the direction that these sheaves are pointed towards? And so we see that Yosef's sheaves are upwards. His brothers are bowing towards them, towards his sheaves. He said, the Torah says, "My sheaf arose and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves encircled it and prostrated themselves to my sheaf." And so one of the ideas here is that these sheaves, they're all gathered individually, as we all are individuals, but also all pointed towards one direction. And so this can be analogous with the idea of various masters and sages that we study. So the masters and the sages can be thought of as having the upright sheaf that is not bowed, not wavered, not dissuaded. And I've had this discussion with people before. They say, okay, you have the Torah, it's convoluted, it's complex, and so what do? You go to the masters and the sages and you look at what they said. And people will say that, why don't you discover it for yourself? Why are you taking the word of somebody that wrote about this 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Why is that your go-to? And my response has always been that it's the fact that their teachings have withstood this test of time that make it relevant, make it reliable. Despite a millennia of being discussed and questioned and posited, their sheaves have remained upright. And so it makes sense to me that if we're going to study Torah and understand it and bring ourselves closer to Hashem, the way to do that is to look toward the sheaf that is unbent, the one that has remained firm despite the millennia of what's gone on. So, as we continue, a couple of verses later, we have another dream. And this says, and he again dreamed another dream, and he related it to his brothers. And he said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. And behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were prostrating themselves to me. So now we have the heavenly bodies that are prostrating themselves to Yosef. And we think to ourselves, wow, this is impressive. Even the sun and the moon and the stars are bowing towards Yosef. And that may seem a little bit grandiose, a little bit excessive. These are great heavenly bodies. So why is it that even they are bowing to Yosef? But we look at the idea that regardless of what the physical manifestation is, all of these things are still created by Hashem. And so it doesn't matter whether it's the sun or the moon, these heavenly bodies, all of these things are subservient to something, that being Hashem. So when we look at the dream and the sheaves of Yosef, and everything in existence is bowing down, to me that's analogous with the idea of Hashem himself. And it's as if at this moment, Yosef's sheaves represent the path of Hashem and the will of Hashem. These other entities are all going to bow down. It doesn't matter how small or insignificant, how great, how large, heavenly bodies, everything is going to bow down to the will of Hashem, and that's what's going to maintain its uprightness. It's almost as if Hashem's will is being seen through the lens through Yosef's sheaves. And that's his path that he has set for us. So we have these two dreams, and we think to ourselves, okay, these are prophetic dreams, and it speaks of the greatness that Yosef will experience, but it doesn't speak of the dangers that he'll experience. You would think a helpful prophetic dream would be one that says, well, your brothers are going to be envious of you and throw you in a pit and then sell you into slavery, and then you're going to go to Egypt and be accused by your master's wife and be put in prison. That would be prophetic. That would be a good thing to know. So why wasn't Yosef given these dreams of imminent danger that he faced? Why wasn't he told, hey, these are the things that are going to happen to you? And the reason being is the idea that this would change the future. If he understood that his brothers, for example, were going to throw him in a pit, he would say, okay, I'm not going out today because I don't want to be thrown in a pit. And because of that, if that happened, he wouldn't be sold into slavery. He wouldn't go to Egypt. And we wouldn't have the great events that happened in Egypt. So then we question, would there be the Jewish people if that happened? I see similarities when a lot of people talk about time travel, and they say, prophecy is similar to time travel. And they say, hey, if you knew of a horrible event that were to happen, would you prevent it? And I would say more often than not, if not every time, my response is always no. I would not prevent it. First of all, that's outside of our realm. To me, that's Hashem's will. Hashem has established the path. And so, if you think about it, the other reason is that we experience things because of not only the good things that have happened, but also the tribulations that have happened. A lot of times we experience more beauty through the tribulations as opposed to avoiding the tribulations. A question that's often posited is, hey, if you could prevent the Holocaust, would you do so? And I would certainly advocate all the atrocities and horrible things that happened being prevented. That would be wonderful if they could be prevented. But at the same time, would it be that wonderful? It was definitely a difficult time, but it's something that we experienced in order to be the people that we are today. Just as we experienced our time in Egypt and our exodus from Egypt. Had we not experienced that, would we have received the Torah and the commandments at Mount Sinai? Had we not experienced that? And that's a good question. I don't know. It reminds me of a story that I was once told about a rabbi, and I forget his name, but he was a Holocaust survivor. And in the concentration camps, there were Jews who had the Torah with them, and there were Jews that wanted to study Torah, and they said, we'd like to study Torah. Can we see and study your Torah? And the Jews who had the Torah said, yes, you can, but you need to give us some of your food rations. And they said, okay, here are my food rations. Just let me study the Torah. And the rabbi who witnessed this was so upset by seeing Jews who were essentially charging other Jews to study the Torah. And he said, from that point on, I'm not going to wear my yarmulke because it's a sign of my disappointment with the Jewish people. And he did this for a while. And later on, someone else came to him and said, you're looking at it the wrong way. And the rabbi said, how so? This was a horrible thing that Jewish people did to other Jews. And the other person said, well, you're focusing on how these Jews wronged other Jews. You should be focusing on the Jews that were willing to give up their food rations to study the Torah. And he thought about it, and he said that was an incredible thing, to be willing to give up your sustenance, your livelihood in order to study the Torah. And he put his yarmulke back on, and in a sense, his faith in the Jewish people was redeemed. And so you have these beautiful things that grow and manifest through the trials and the tribulations. And I know this is kind of going down a tangent, but it's very important to look at those things. There's the adage that things grow out of soil and manure and stuff. You take this stuff, and out of it blooms these beautiful growths and so that's what we're looking at. To bring it back to the discussion, if Joseph had known and foresaw the tribulations that he was going to face and then avoided them, where would we be today? Would we be the people that we are today? And so that's why he received the dreams that he received. So those are the dreams. And so then we continue on, and of course Joseph tells his brothers, and that, along with receiving the coat from his father, creates the envy from his brothers, and they throw him into a pit, an empty pit. And so let's see here. So basically they throw him into this pit, and there's discussion about, this specification of an empty pit. And the idea is that the pit wasn't actually in itself empty. We see that from the Gemara. So he's thrown into a pit without water. That doesn't mean it's empty, it just doesn't have water. It says, and they took him and cast him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, there was no water in it. But that doesn't mean there wasn't nothing in it. So the understanding is that in the pit were snakes and scorpions. And so we look at the actions of Reuben, his brother, who essentially dissuaded his brothers from harming Yosef. And we think to ourselves, how does that work? He's thrown into a pit with snakes and scorpions. That doesn't really seem to be sparing him from harm. That seems very dangerous. Or Chaim has a very interesting interpretation of this. And that is that a person has free will. They're free to make decisions. They can choose to do a good deed. They can choose to do a bad deed. And along with this, free will means that a person can end another person's life prematurely, before their time. That's not something that's in Hashem's hands, because we have free will. That's something that is within the person's hands. However, animals cannot do that. Animals do not have the free will. So the snakes and the scorpions don't have the free will to kill a person unless that's something that is brought about through Hashem's will. So his brother saw that the greater risk to Yosef was from his brothers, because they had free will. They could decide to harm him, whereas the animals at the bottom of the well couldn't harm him in any way, because if it was not his time, then the animals wouldn't harm him. If Hashem had willed it, the animals wouldn't harm him, so he'd harm him. So believing that the Yosef had Hashem on his side and had the support of Hashem, he said better to throw him into a pit with snakes and scorpions that won't harm him without Hashem's say-so than for him to face his brothers who have free will and essentially could harm him. Rambam was definitely one who was of this idea that people are not predestined. He spoke about it at length. People have the free will. They're not predestined. Their path isn't set. They have the free will to choose if they want to be on that path or not. And what Rambam postulated is, how can you have a reward for behaviors? How can you have punishment for behaviors if everything's predestined? If everything's determined, the path is already created, and your actions are set in stone. If that is the case, then how can you justify reward or punishment, given that you don't have any choice in that? You can't punish somebody for doing an act that they have no control over, that's going to happen anyways. You can't give somebody a reward for an act that they do if they were going to do it no matter what. So what it comes down to is personal responsibility. What is the personal level of responsibility? What decisions are you going to make? How are you going to exercise your free will? That's a choice that only you can make. And in my opinion, one of the great blessings of our existence is that we have that opportunity to choose, what we're going to do, how we're going to act. Above and beyond all other creations, this is something that's unique. that we are entitled with this personal responsibility. And so with this responsibility, how are we going to act? What choices are we going to make? Okay. So we'll continue on with the next few verses that deal with Joseph's brothers and their treatment of him. And one of the things that we learn from this is how important it is to avoid having anger with those who have wronged us. This is an important lesson to show that. And this is something that Joseph did. He did avoid anger with those who wronged him, with his brothers. And we'll see that later on as we continue through the weeks. And the reason why this is important is because we do not know or understand the will of Hashem. This is something that I discussed in previous parshas, but that's not for us to know. Our purpose and our reason for existence is to fulfill Hashem's will, not to understand why things happen. And so in thinking that, if our only role is to fulfill the will of Hashem but not to understand it, then how can we have anger for those who have wronged us? We don't know why they wronged us. We don't know what the reasoning is behind that, and it's not our job to. So it's important that we don't pass judgment on others and determine that we're going to be angry with them. I've made this analogy many times before. It's one that I'm fond of, but the idea comes from the idea of a child who wants candy. And we are like children in our existence and in comparison to Hashem. And the child will go to the parent and say, I want candy. And I want candy all day, every day. And the parent says, no, that's not going to happen. And the child gets upset because the child wants candy. Now, how can the parent explain this to the child in a way that the child would understand? The parent is somewhat limited in what they can impart to the child, just as Hashem is limited in what can be imparted to us. The parent could describe things like diabetes and obesity and all these different outcomes from having candy all day long. But the child wouldn't understand. The child doesn't understand obesity. The child doesn't understand things like diabetes and can't comprehend that in the same way that we can't comprehend in our daily existence why things happen. We have to have faith that things are happening for a good reason. Just in that the parent telling the child they can't have candy is happening for a good reason. It's happening for the health of the child. But the child doesn't understand that. And so the child gets angry because why can't they have candy? They should be allowed to have candy. The parent's not letting the child have candy, so the child is angry with the parent. So we should avoid anger with those who have wronged us because we don't know what the reason is for that happening. That's with Hashem. And it makes me think of people that we encounter in our everyday lives, that we could harbor anger for, but we don't understand what the motivations or the reasoning is. So, for example, I have people tell me, or I'll be speaking with somebody and I'll say, oh, I really like this person. They do X, Y, and Z. They like giving and they're very amicable and very friendly, and I really like them. And the other person will say to me, well, I don't like them at all. That's not the person I know. That's an interesting facet, saying that's not the person I know. So even though the person is the same, two people know that person as a different person. And so what right do we have to say, I'm going to harbor anger against this person? Essentially, we're saying this is who this person is, and this is why I'm angry with them, when we may not understand the person at all. You take it to the next level to understand why Hashem has put this in front of you, this person that you want to be angry with. We have no idea. So it doesn't serve any purpose for us to be angry with that person. That anger doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't do anything for anyone. And so this is an important passage that we learn from Yosef. We had mentioned before that Yosef is very wise, and it's conceivable that he could have retaliated against his brothers. He could have sought retribution. He could have harbored this anger, and he didn't. And again, I posit that that's something that has come from the teachings of Yitzhak and Yaakov and Abraham that were passed down to him. I have no doubt in my mind that he was a very wise and intelligent person. So he knew not to retaliate against his brothers. He didn't harbor that anger. And that's an important aspect that we can all incorporate into our daily lives. So we'll continue on. Again, as I had discussed, Yosef is put in the well, taken out of the well, sold to the Ishmaelites, and he travels to Egypt, where he becomes a slave in the household of the minister to the Pharaoh, and is successful. And it's mentioned a number of times that that Hashem was with Yosef and that he was successful in his pursuits. Which is, again, even harkening back to last week's Parsha, an important aspect to understand. A person could say, all these bad things are happening to me. I didn't do anything to deserve this, but we don't understand the meaning. But if we follow the path of Hashem, then Hashem will be with us, and we'll be successful, even if we don't see that success. Like I said, Yosef could say, I was thrown into a pit, and I was sold into slavery, and accusations were made by my master's wife, and then thrown in prison. To be looking at that negative aspect and saying, I'm not getting any success, but the Torah clearly states, as it does here in verse 2, chapter 39, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. So, Joseph is in the house of his master, the minister to the Pharaoh, and the minister's wife continually makes advances towards Joseph, and he continually declines these advances. And there's an interesting part here, verse 9, where it says, in this house there is no one greater than I, and he has not withheld anything from me except you, referring to his master, insofar as you are his wife. Now how can I commit this great evil and sin against God? And this is an important thing that he says, because essentially he's citing two things: commit a great evil and sin against God. So there's two things going on here. One's a great evil and one's a sin against God. And this is a very interesting distinction to make, and it shows the distinction that human beings face in that there's a sin against yourself and a sin against the will of Hashem. And a single act could account for both of those. You could be harming yourself and also harming your relationship with Hashem. In this way, we should look at all of our singular actions as having two, if not multiple, ramifications. That's why it's so important for us to consider our actions. Things don't exist and we do this, so this happens. What happens is we do this, so this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's essentially the idea of the butterfly effect. Basically, the idea of the butterfly effect is that a butterfly far away, let's say, on the opposite hemisphere, flaps its wings, and as that air movement travels, it affects other things, it affects weather systems, and all of a sudden there's a tornado a half a world around. That's the butterfly effect. And so we have to think of our actions in that light. The things that we do, simple actions that we take that may seem insignificant, could have a whole host of ramifications. And so in this verse, Yosef is at least acknowledging two ramifications that are very important. The first being that it is evil for him to do for himself internally, and second, it's against the will of Hashem, and this would be a sin against Hashem. So that shows us that we should be mindful of the actions that we take. And so we continue on, and his master's wife goes on, tells his master that he's been making advances and he's put into prison. And what happens while he's there? There are other people, two people specifically, that are mentioned in the prison. And we have the cupbearer and the baker. And they have dreams, and Yosef interprets these dreams for them. These dreams come true. The one of the interesting things that I was reflecting on when I saw this is that we have the cupbearer and the baker. And I thought to myself, when do we see these two things in tandem? And I was thinking about it, and we see these two things during Shabbat, right? We have our cup that is full of wine, and we have our challah. So it struck me as interesting that Yosef is interpreting dreams for the cupbearer, who essentially the reason why he was in prison was he was serving wine, and there was a fly in the wine. So he's serving the wine, and then we have the baker who was serving bread. And it's very interesting that this hearkening to our Shabbat practices, it seemed just very interesting to me. And I thought about it, and what do we look at when we have the wine on Shabbat? We're looking at the sweetness, the joy, the love, all these positive things. And we have the challah, which symbolizes a sacrifice at the old temple. It's a sacrifice. It's something that's given up, something that we lose. And so this was a really interesting thing, seeing the outcome of these two. So the cupbearer ends up retaining his position; he gets it back, and this is a positive outcome. This is the happiness and the joy. Whereas the baker, on the other hand, is put to death. So this is the sacrifice, the loss, and I just found that to be very interesting, that these are the two that are specified in the story with Yosef, when we see these aspects every week on Shabbat. And really what we're looking at again is a service to self and a service to Hashem. We look at the joy and the pleasure that we get from the wine is more of an act of service to ourselves. The challah, representing the sacrifice at the temple, is the service to Hashem. That's something that's for Hashem. And so, again, we look at this idea and say, okay, finding pleasure in our own lives is a good thing. It's, that's all right. But what's really important is the service to Hashem. And when we look at the fate of the baker, we see that that's something that shouldn't be toyed with, because it has serious consequences. That first and foremost should be the service to Hashem. So that's just a connection that I drew. And then we get to the idea where the cupbearer is released, returns to his posting, and then forgets to tell Pharaoh about Yosef. And there's a lot of discussion about this. Just briefly, I'll mention two of the distinctions that I've come across. One is that The reason why the cupbearer forgot is because Yosef asked twice, and he shouldn't have asked twice. And so this idea of persistence in having to ask twice is in a way seen as an affront. So it says in verse 14, "But remember me when things go well with you, and please do me a favor and mention to me Pharaoh, and you will get me out of this house." So we asked twice. So that's one idea. The other idea is that Yosef is exhibiting that he does not have faith in Hashem. As I said earlier in this portion, Yosef, it's made very clear that he had the support of Hashem. Hashem was with him, and he found success. And so, what does he tell the cupbearer? He tells them, "Do me a favor and mention me to Pharaoh, and you will get me out of this house." So who's he putting his faith in? He's putting his faith in the cupbearer, not in Hashem. Yosef is full of good deeds, has support of Hashem. So why is he not looking to the salvation from Hashem? Why is he looking to salvation from the cupbearer? So those are just a couple of ideas that are posited from the sages as to why the cupbearer forgot to mention Yosef to Pharaoh. And that's where this week's Parsha ends. So I'd like to summarize just a little bit. What do we take away from this Parsha? What have we learned, and what can we incorporate in our daily lives? What should we incorporate in our daily lives? A couple of things. Really, again, the importance of the will of Hashem is mentioned throughout the Parsha, as it was the previous Parsha and the Parsha before that. How important it is that your sheaves are focused in that direction. That's what you're pointed to. That's where your compass lies. And understanding the impact of our actions. Like I mentioned, the butterfly effect. What is the overall picture? We don't know what the overall picture is. We don't know if we take one particular step or behavior or action, what will happen around us. And it's not for us to know, as I said. What our role is to fulfill the will of Hashem. And so there will be negative things that happen, and there could be positive outcomes. So we look at Yosef. All these negative things happened. We have the Jewish people. The same can be said in our daily lives for an individual. We may think that, hey, a lot of negative things are happening, but I'm going to continue the pursuit of the will of Hashem, and I'm not doing that so that I have good outcomes instead of bad outcomes, because we don't know the overall picture. We don't know if something's good for us or not. What we do know is what we can do, and we can fulfill the will of Hashem. So we see this, with Yosef and his brothers, him ending up in jail, like I said. As I said in the intro, the openings, again, we discuss Yehuda and his son's killed, and he impregnates his daughter-in-law. And we look at all these things as being negative. The outcome of all these things is, again, the Davidic line, So even though we can perceive momentarily individual negative events, we can't possibly know whether the outcome of those events is positive or not. That's something important to take with us. Another thing that I wanted to discuss just really quickly, as I said, is that we've been looking at kind of the trend that we've been seeing in this part of the Torah for the last few parshas, the importance of following the will of Hashem and the service to Hashem. And then we'll continue on, and we will look at the time in Egypt, and then we'll continue on to the receiving of the Torah and the commandments. It's really interesting the way the Torah is laid out. Essentially, what we're looking at here is the Torah opens up with here's why you should listen to me. I'm telling you now, I'm going to give you all these examples of people that had faith, and these are the good things that came of it. And then we have this momentous event of the Exodus from Egypt and the receiving of the Torah and the commandments at Mount Sinai. So then the event happens. Now we're going to specify the different things that we should do to follow Hashem. And it's really interesting that it's laid out that way. A lot of times there's discussion as to who wrote the Torah. There's all these writers, and you can tell in the different speech patterns and the different ways things were written and this and that. So the idea is, at least for me, is that you can have different tones of voice, you can have different writing patterns, you can have different vocabulary for different situations. Essentially, the Torah being written by Hashem can be worded in any way, from verse to verse, phrase to phrase. I certainly believe that Hashem is capable of making it appear as different writers have written the Torah. Why would he do that? And so if we think about even in our daily lives, if I'm to write a letter to somebody, who that person I'm writing the letter to is going to be different. Whether I'm writing it to my boss or to my wife or to young nieces and nephews, I can write the same thing to everybody, but it's going to be written vastly different ways. Definitely something written to my boss, say perhaps seeking a promotion or something, is going to be a lot more formal, a lot more structured, and a lot more professional than me sending a text message to my wife that says yada, 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 and all this shorthand and parts of words and stuff. Let's say you took a letter to my boss and a text message to my wife and compared them side by side. You would say two different people wrote these. It has to be two different people because it's so different. That's not exactly the case. Why do I write them differently? It's for the recipient. It's for the recipient to understand more than just the words that are written, but what the meaning is behind what is written. And so we can look at the Torah and say, the first part of the Torah is focused so much on these people's lives and what they did and how they curried favor for Hashem and how they followed the will of Hashem. And then there's this drastic shift to almost news accounting of this event happened, this event happened, this event happened. It's almost biographical. And then it shifts again to, okay, these are the commandments. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And you say, well, hang on a second. These are completely different people that are writing this. And I would posit not necessarily. The idea is to phrase things differently, position things differently, not only for different people to understand, but also for a person to understand differently. Excuse me. I think that everyone can agree that we all have different aspects of our lives. We all have different facets and different ways that we behave. We're with all of our emotions and our thoughts and our feelings, we're in a sense an amalgamation of many different people. I can be the angry person. I can be the happy person. I can be the sad person. And so these different parts of the Torah are expressed in different ways to address those different people. And that way I feel like the Torah is the most accessible bit of literature for anybody to receive, because all of those different facets of that person, all the different aspects can receive Torah. Torah is not just written for the happy person in me. It's not just written for the sad person in me. It's written for all of the people in me. And that's accomplished by writing it differently at different parts. And those parts interweave. We could say that the last part is focused on this is this commandment, this is this commandment, this is this commandment, but it also does incorporate parts from the beginning of the Torah that discuss this is why you should listen, and this is why you should heed the words of the Torah. And there are events that are in there. So we see focuses in different parts of the Torah, but also that each part of the Torah reaches all of us in our entirety. So those are my ideas, thoughts, and studies on Parsha Vayeishev. I want to thank you again for joining me. Certainly feel free to leave any comments or questions. I'm happy to respond. I also wanted to say again, you're welcome to make donations on the Patreon page that's listed in the description below, as well as on the channel homepage. Also, don't forget, as I said in the opening, I do the morning shacharit prayers Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Please join, as well as the discussions on Sunday at noon Pacific Standard Time. Again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a day and week filled with blessings. Thank you.